Everyone, thank you for coming today for the first of our three-part series on nonprofit management. My name is Erica Hill, and I'm the Community Arts Development Specialist in Northern Nevada. The Community Arts Development Program supports Nevada's nonprofit arts and cultural organizations, municipalities, public institutions, and communities with a variety of programs and services aimed to build vibrant communities statewide. We often get requests from nonprofits for assistance on various topics, and it has been a few years since the Nevada Arts Council has offered a professional development series in nonprofit management. So we wanted to provide to the public a free resource in nonprofit management to act as a refresher or a jumpstart for organizations. Today's topic is how to start a nonprofit, but please also join us in 2 weeks on January 23rd at 11 a.m. for Going Beyond Great Programs, Building Organizational Capacity for the Long Haul. And in a month on February 6th for Building Your Influence and Reach, External Relationships and Networking. We will record these webinars and post it to our YouTube channel for future reference so that you can continue to watch these and strengthen your own nonprofit arts and cultural organizations in the state. At the end of each webinar, we'll open the floor to questions, but should you have any questions along the way, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. For this nonprofit management series, we are joined by guest expert Jessica Word, Assistant Professor at the School of Public Policy and Leadership at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Jessica received her doctorate in public administration and policy from Florida State University in 2006. Her research focuses on capacity building in the public and nonprofit sectors. I am pleased to introduce you and give our biggest welcome to Dr. Jessica Word. Thank you, Jessica, for working with us to provide this nonprofit management series.
Hi, everybody. I'm excited to join you guys today. We have a lot of ground to cover. But if you do have questions, you can throw them in the chat as we go. And if I can't get to them while I'm doing the presentation, we'll revisit those at the end during the question period. So I'm going to go ahead and get the presentation up here and start sharing that. All right, can everybody see that?
Looking good.
All right. So today we're going to start talking about how you actually start the process of incorporation of your nonprofit and actually get going with this. It can seem like a really big task. And it's hard to kind of figure out what all the steps are, especially from the outside if you haven't done it. So one of the things I would say is also use your network and ask your friends who've gone through this process, because it seems really scary, but it's actually mostly paperwork and decisions. Uh-oh. Can't get the slide to advance. Hang on 1 second, guys. Technical difficulties always happen. All right, can everybody still see me?
I can see you.
Okay, and the slides now?
I cannot see the slides.
Uh-oh. Technology is wonderful until it doesn't work, right?
Absolutely. Do it 50 times, right?
Mike, we just tested this out. All right.
Perfect.
Okay. So let's start by talking about the kind of major pieces that we're going to go through today. The first is just getting started. What are the things you need to get ready before you start thinking about filing with the state of Nevada, and then also with the IRS and the federal government. The first section is actually the biggest section, is all the stuff that you need to do ahead of filing that paperwork. And then I'm also going to kind of briefly go through the paperwork. I also have a handout, which I've sent to Erica, and that we'll share with everybody who attended today, that has lots of links and advice and resources for each of these little pieces and examples that you can look at. Because I think what's really important is to go and look for examples that are similar to the type of organization you're going to start, and to really use those examples to help you sort of puzzle through all these pieces. All right. So let's start by talking about why you would want to go from having sort of an informal group of artists that work together or get together to work on things, and why you would want to go that next step into a incorporation. So one is really just to sort of establish the organization as its own entity, and the organization in turn, and to give it some legitimacy and permanency. One of the problems with everything being organized around one person or a small group of people is as those people leave and exit or even pass away, then sometimes the group goes away as well. And so what we want to do is build organization. One of the reasons to do this is to build an organization that will last on beyond the life of the individuals involved with it. The other reason is to protect your financial assets and your financial well-being. To separate the organization from you as an individual gives you some financial protection. So say, for example, if you hosted an event as an individual and somebody fell or got hurt at the event, then you might be personally liable. If you separately incorporate and get appropriate insurance and stuff for that event, that would mean that the liability would actually get transferred to that organization versus you and yourself and your own assets being on the line. So that's one of the really big reasons. I talk about in my classes at UNLV, one of the reasons I had a group I worked with that we incorporated, we had a running group. And when we first started, there were just like 5 or 10 of us that would meet once a week in the parking lots and go for a long run. Over time, that grew to be a couple hundred people. And we ended up, incorporating as a running group because we wanted to limit that liability issue because we actually did have somebody get hurt. They did not sue us, but it kind of woke us up. And then we also wanted to start holding more formal 5Ks and things to raise money to continue to support sort of running and physical fitness activities for youth in the area we were at. And so that we actually went through the process of incorporation when I was in graduate school. The other reason and you can do that either as a for-profit or as a nonprofit. And so I also want to talk a little bit about sort of the benefits of being a nonprofit in particular. One of the reasons is, again, you want to attract donations and other support that's hard to get as a for-profit. Volunteers are great, and they can be really helpful to your organization, particularly if you have some sort of an outreach mission attached to it. But they're less likely to show up for a for-profit than they are for a nonprofit. There are, of course, tax advantages to being a nonprofit, which is, again, one of the main reasons people choose to be a nonprofit, that you don't have to pay income taxes or other taxes. And so that can help you manage your expenses in a different way. And in lots of ways, especially as a small nonprofit, the tax implications are really easy to manage, and the process is relatively easy to manage in terms of reporting once you get through the steps of actually setting yourself up. Other advantages, you can get reduced postage rates. There's usually lots of discounts available to nonprofits. So say if you're working with your local government and want to reserve an event space, usually there's a nonprofit rate which is less than a corporate or a for-profit rate. And then the last benefits, some people don't see as a benefit, it's what we call collegial decision making. When you incorporate as a nonprofit, you have to form a board, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that as well. And that collegial decision making means that you form this board that helps guide the organization and helps give you some ideas about how and where you want to take the organization. But that means that you have to work with that group. And hopefully the parts are more than come together in a way that helps you make better decisions than you would by yourself. But that is something to take into account if you want to do it all yourself and not share decision-making authority, then maybe a for-profit versus a nonprofit is something you want to think about. All right, so the next thing that we want to talk about is branding. So one of the very first most important tasks that you have to do as a nonprofit or even as a corporation is actually to choose a name for your new legal entity. Much like naming a child, this can feel like a big decision. So just a couple things you want to think about. Unless you have a huge budget for branding and marketing like Apple or Tesla or other corporations where the name doesn't necessarily match the product that well, pick something that really clearly communicates what you do and doesn't sound too much like another organization, because this can cause confusion. And if that organization goes through a scandal or does something you don't like, then that confusion can reflect poorly on your organization as well. And if you pick something that isn't clear, it can also be a barrier for people to find you and to get involved. So for example, when I was working in Florida, I worked with this great nonprofit and their name was the Family Cafe, which makes it sound like they served food or did some sort of food training. They were actually a disability nonprofit. And the idea was that they had a menu of services, but a lot of people just never found them because of the name. And eventually they had to go through a whole rebranding effort. So as you kind of think about what things you want to do with your organization, you want to make sure you pick a name that's a broad enough umbrella, but again, is still clear about what your mission is and what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. The next major thing is to really write a mission statement and to think about what we call corporate purpose. So a mission statement is something that, again, helps with branding your organization. It's sort of like your elevator pitch. And that elevator pitch should be clear and concise and give everybody in your organization or who's with your organization the ability to explain what you do and who you do it for relatively quickly. And so it should basically just state the purpose of the organization, the nature of the work, the reason it exists, and the clients and constituencies it's designed to serve. So sometimes that's geographic. So if you're in Elko and you're starting an arts collective in Elko, then you would call, maybe you would call it the Elko Arts Collective. Again, that and maybe the mission would be something like to promote the arts and artists in Elko or arts education in Elko. And so it can be very short. There's a tendency for lots of organizations to want to write these really broad, very complicated mission statements. Those are usually not great because, again, they're not memorable. It makes it hard to explain. And what it does communicate to people outside is maybe you aren't clear on what you want to do and how you're going to do it. So that's the other thing that I would say about. So we have a quick question here. How difficult is it to change the name of an existing nonprofit organization? I would say it's not that difficult. It's paperwork, and you can actually usually do it by doing what we call a doing business as, which would kind of informally change it. Okay. So I'm going to go back to the corporate purpose. The corporate purpose is something that goes eventually in your bylaws. And it's a fairly generic statement. Again, I've included an example in the handout, which is 5 pages long. So I apologize for the length of our handouts, which basically says that you plan to organize as a nonprofit under the laws of the state. The second part basically is a brief summary of your mission, which you will include as part of your articles of incorporation and bylaws as well. So that's why this is one of the very first pieces you're going to work on. Now, if you're the founder, you can either do this by yourself or with maybe the people who you think are going to be part of your starting board. And so that's what we're going to talk about next. So the next thing that and now it's not advancing the slide. There it is. Okay. So the next piece is sort of choosing the structure or type of nonprofit you want to be or that fits your activities. The most common type of nonprofit is a corporation. Other common types in the arts can include co-ops, A corporation just means that it's a way to create a legal entity that's distinct from you. So I know when we talk about corporations, we usually think about for-profits, not nonprofits, but nonprofits are also corporations. A co-op is a little bit different. A lot of people are familiar with co-ops. They were really popular in the 70s and the 60s. And co-ops are a way for communities to get together to cooperatively do something. And arts co-ops are actually pretty common. And what they do is they really can allow you to create sort of a common marketing campaign or a common even workspace that's kind of owned and held by a group of people versus being held by one or a small group of people. In fact, I visited an arts co-op a couple years ago in Santa Fe that had lots of really vibrant programming. And part of the reason they existed was as a group, they could get together and buy space. They also could buy things like expensive equipment like kilns. And also they would do sort of a First Fridays sort of arts activities so that they could draw the public in and market their work. And the other reason they had formed was that as a co-op, they could also look at things like helping individual artists get health insurance and other benefits as well. And so there are reasons to also think about a co-op if you're a group of kind of working artists that also can make a lot of sense. We have another question. Oh, nope. Okay. So the next big piece is selecting your board of directors. If you're sort of on your own, starting your nonprofit, this is sort of your first go-to die-hard group of people that you want to get involved in your organization. Under Nevada law, you are only required to have one person on a board, but best practice is at least 3 to 5. And part of the reason for that is there's actually 3 required corporate officers in the state of Nevada, a treasurer, a secretary, and a board president or chair. And so while sometimes you have a secretary treasurer position together, you at least probably need 2. And those of you who have been part of group decision making know 2 means that you always have a tie, so 3 would be a better choice. So in general, we recommend that you have a odd number of board members. Again, so if there is decision making and back and forth around decisions, that you have somebody to break a tie. Another thing that you really want is somebody who really knows something about your mission or knows a lot about the community or has lots of connections if you're thinking about board members. And then the final thing, and this thing is access to resources. Now, a lot of organizations place the most emphasis on this piece, but I would say somebody who has access to resources or is a donor can be a great board member, but only if they're also passionate and knowledgeable about your mission. You want people who actually care and who are going to show up and who are going to be the first volunteer to sign up to do things and aren't going to get tired of your mission and your organization over time. So you want somebody who's actually going to be actively involved versus, in Las Vegas, it's always, somebody who sits on the board of MGM or somebody who's an executive of one of these casino companies. But those aren't great board members if they don't actually care about your organization. Yes, they may be able to write a check, but chances are you may know somebody or you may have a board member who knows somebody who knows those people already. So they may still be willing to write that check. We'll talk more about fundraising in one of the later. I'm just not having a good day with Zoom. Okay. So the next big piece is what we call the Articles of Incorporation. These are this is the first sort of set of things that as an organization you have to pull together, and this will help you finish the paperwork for both the state and the federal government. Again, it involves your organization's name, the purpose of the nonprofit. And one of the other things that's important to include in articles of incorporation, because nobody owns a nonprofit. So even if you found a nonprofit, you don't own it. It's a community organization and a community resource. You have to include in your articles of incorporation what's called a statement regarding the dissolution of assets. And again, there's some sample bylaws and sample articles of incorporation included in the handout I'm going to give everybody. And basically, this just explains that when you dissolve the organization in the future, any assets that the organization has accumulated will be distributed for an exempt purpose. So say you're an arts organization, and after 50 years of operating and hosting arts events in Elko, I keep picking on Elko. You have decided it's time to close up shop, or the CEO wants to retire and there's not necessarily somebody who wants to take over the organization. That means that you have to actually distribute those assets to another nonprofit in the community, usually ideally a nonprofit with a similar or related mission. So it could be an education group that does some arts work or something else. Because you built up those assets under that tax exempt status, those assets then have to also be distributed to a tax exempt entity as well. So this, again, articles of incorporation are just a really short document that you file when you start the organization. The bigger piece and the harder piece to get going is what we call the bylaws. And the bylaws are basically the rules that govern your organization, or sort of like a constitution for your organization. And those rules are actually things that you decide on as an organization. So again, you're going to see a lot of these things over and over again. The purpose or the mission of your organization is one of the first things that goes into your bylaws. The next thing is how you're going to select your board members. So once you have selected that initial group of board members, you want to outline a process for how you continue to have board members and how you bring new board members into your organization. So whether they're appointed or recruited and then voted on by the board, and how they become board members. Usually it's a majority vote of the directors at a board meeting. And you also probably want to set a minimum and a maximum number of board members. Again, you don't want to have just one or two board members, especially if you're a new organization and you don't have staff. Again, boards are one of your first resources in terms of volunteers and fundraising. And so you want to have probably, again, 3 to 5 or 5 to 7 board members as a starting board. But you also don't want it to be so big, because that becomes difficult to make decisions when you have a bigger board. And then it can also be more difficult to kind of have a board that's continually full, and otherwise you spend a ton of time recruiting. The other piece that you will outline in your bylaws, is how your board makes decisions, whether that is a simple majority rule, whether that's a 2/3 vote, whether how they can vote, whether that's electronically or it has to be in person. How often you're going to meet. Again, generally you should be meeting at least every quarter, or at a minimum biannually as a board of directors. I think quarterly is a nice, that means every 3 months or so, meeting as a board and checking in. Some nonprofits meet as often, their boards meet as often as once a month. I would say it just really depends on the needs of your organization. You also want to talk about how often, how you will notify board members about meetings, especially if you're making important decisions. You want to make sure to give people enough notice that they can put it on their calendars. And so sort of the standard time frame is usually a week to 2 weeks ahead of a scheduled board meeting. And then how you conduct those meetings, whether they're going to be led by the board president or the executive director. And then who are the officers? Again, under Nevada law, you have to have a president, a secretary, and a treasurer, but you can have a vice chair, you can have additional officers as well. You can have committee members or fundraising chairs, etc. So you want to think about who are the people that you want to make sure you have in place and what are their jobs and duties. And all this, at least briefly, should be outlined in your bylaws. The other thing that is included in bylaws is the creation of any committees. So say you have a big annual event, and that's maybe one of the reasons you're starting a nonprofit. Maybe you want to create a committee that's in charge of that event and give them some authority to make decisions without the board. Or maybe they have to present ideas to the board and have the board vote on those, especially ones that have a financial impact on the organization. Usually those get presented back to the board for decision making. And then a discussion of how you can update and amend bylaws if they need changing. I've worked with a couple organizations around that. You want to think about if you're having a hard time getting your board members to show up, whether you want to have a simple majority to make amendments, or whether you want to have a 2/3 or a super majority to make amendments. Also, what constitutes a quorum for your board? Whether, again, you have to have at least 50% of your board to make decisions, which is pretty standard. You don't want just 2 people calling a board meeting, getting together and making a decision if you have 10 board members. And then you also want to think about how regularly and what reports need to be made to the board. So some standard reports are things like finances, updating the board on the finances of the organization, updating them regularly on events and how those events went. And so as you grow as an organization and have more events and more programs and more employees, eventually, hopefully, then you also want to think about what kind of reports, and you may actually end up adding additional reports into your bylaws. The last thing, which is really important and can be really important, especially as you're looking for donors and support external to your organization, is the conflict of interest policy. So while this isn't required under federal law, there are some things that are reported once you do file with the IRS. And one of the things that is reported and is publicly available information is whether or not you have a conflict of interest policy. So a conflict of interest policy is just a simple policy that basically says what the rules are around decisions that may financially enhance or impact board members or employees. So for example, if I'm a board member and I have done a ton of work for the organization, can I be compensated for that work, or am I only going to be able to do that as a volunteer? What are the rules around that compensation? What does that look like? And again, most board members are strictly volunteers. In your startup phase, you may have an executive director that serves both on the board and as maybe the executive director or CEO. But as you mature as an organization, you want to separate those roles because the board is in charge of overseeing the organization and the executive director is in charge of the day-to-day operations. And so you really want to think about what sort of conflicts are possible with your organization and how you would manage those. So often if there's even a slight conflict of interest with a board member, one of the ways that organizations manage that is board members have to recuse themselves if there's any financial piece from any voting that would take place. And usually have to excuse themselves from the discussion around that as well. So that may mean the board member steps out while the board votes on compensation pieces. Or this also gets really tricky if, say, a board member is married to the executive director or is a family member. So you want to think through some of that stickiness. And part of the reason this is important is donors really look at these things to make sure that you're not just forming an organization to enrich yourself, because again, as a nonprofit, we're supposed to be serving a public purpose and a community purpose and not just ourselves. And I'm sure you've all seen lots of scandalous newspaper articles about nonprofits that seem to be serving themselves versus their communities. A few other little notes on bylaws. Again, you don't want them to be too complicated or too long, especially as you get started. Keep them as simple as you can. Because again, as we talked about, you can always amend and update those bylaws later. Make sure as you recruit new board members to give them a copy of the bylaws and remind them to read them, because again, these are sort of the rules of the organization and how the organization is run. And it usually outlines also the expectations for board members. If you vote to amend the bylaws, make sure to record the vote and update your bylaw document. I recommend new nonprofit starts from a Google Drive for the organization, and all these important documents get uploaded into the cloud. And then it's not like who has the notebook, and then you give people access to it when they're on the board, and you can take access away as they exit the organization. And so everybody has access to those governing documents and can see them, and whether or not they have edit access. Usually edit access is sort of the executive team. So the secretary, the treasurer, and the executive director and board president. Once you've drafted your bylaws, you should hold your first board meeting and officially vote to adopt the bylaws and the conflict of interest policy. You should actually elect those officers. So the board president, the chair, the treasurer, and the secretary. And then you should also decide what your fiscal year would be. So commonly fiscal years either start with the calendar year, so January 1st, like your personal finances, or for lots of organizations, including the state of Nevada, we start our new fiscal year on July 1, and it runs through June 30th. And usually is sort of dependent on when you started your organization, which of these fiscal years you choose, or sometimes it's dictated by sort of your grants and some other things. See, there's another question. Is the bylaws where committees are noted? Yes, the bylaws can be where committees are noted. It's not always the case. Sometimes, again, you start without committees and then update or amend your bylaws. It's nice to put in the bylaws what committees you expect to have. And then often you can add a clause in the bylaws about ad hoc committees, which are sort of temporary committees, and how those are created and how those go away. I see Erica also shared the handout in the chat as well. So please feel free to look at that either now or after. All right, so now we're finally at the point where we're going to file paperwork. I know it feels like a long time, but the paperwork's actually probably, despite being the scariest part, is probably one of the easiest parts once you've done all these other steps. So the paperwork for the state of Nevada, there's actually in that handout, there is a link to the packet that's required by the Secretary of State. There is some state level guidance on this, but the last time it was updated was 2008. And so that's why I pulled together some more recent resources. I think the 2008 document is still up to date, but I would again look to other places that have posted guidance more recently. So to file your paperwork with the state, formation, the first piece of paperwork is called the formation of a nonprofit corporation. There are a few, again, as you think about which style of organization you want to be, whether you're a co-op or whether you're a member association or whether you're a regular incorporation. They're slightly different forms, but they're all relatively similar. You'll also need an initial list of directors. It's important to make sure that everybody who you put on that list has signed on to that, because it does cost money if you have to update it, at least your initial list. A state business license. The state business license is required until you get 501c3 recognition from the IRS. There's actually an exemption form for that license fee once you have 501c3 recognition from the federal government. The last piece is what we call registered, or the last couple pieces are a registered agent. Registered agents are individuals who are willing to receive paperwork on behalf of the organization and legal notices on behalf of the organization. So again, if your organization were to be sued, who would receive that paperwork? So it has to be a physical address in the state of Nevada, and it has to be accessible during business hours. So there are actually people you can pay to be a fiscal agent or a registered agent for you. Usually it's the executive director, the board chair, or the founder who receives those documents. An important thing to remember, which a lot of nonprofits do forget, especially if they're all volunteer run, is to make sure to update that registered agent if that person changes or that person is no longer associated with your organization, because again, that's the address people will send things to, and you could miss out on important notification. So it's probably 7 years ago now, the IRS changed the reporting requirements for small nonprofits. A lot of agencies lost their tax status because they hadn't updated their registered agent address or their address with the IRS. And so those important notifications from the IRS, and there were multiple ones, went to the wrong person. And a lot of agencies then had to go ask for reinstatement, and it cost organizations at least a couple $1,000s usually to get that resolved. Okay. Don't forget to, so then the next piece is to apply, if you plan to solicit charitable donations in the state of Nevada, you also have to fill out a charitable solicitation form. This is important whether you're just doing business in Nevada or if you're registered in Nevada. And then the last pieces, and again, this has gotten organizations shut down, so these are important to check with your local government about what business licenses you may need to operate in the county or city that you're in. If you're in an unincorporated area, you want to check with your county. If you're in a municipality like Henderson, where I live, you want to check with the city of Henderson or your local municipal government to see what business licenses you need from them. Usually there's a small business office that can help you a little bit with that. Again, they mostly deal with for-profits, but again, they are there to help people get business licenses. They will also usually help nonprofits. And the other piece is to obtain a federal tax ID number. So federal tax ID numbers, you can go in and get one. It takes literally 10 minutes. It's a very short process. I just saw the question about a founder's board position. They can either be a member of the board, or sometimes they are the executive director and the board chair when you start. Eventually, it's good to sort of separate out those positions. Okay, so the next piece is really actually filing that IRS paperwork. Filing the IRS paperwork, again, seems super daunting. This is the longest piece of paperwork you're going to have to do, and it can be relatively complex, but once you've made it through the hurdle of filing with the state, this is just a little bit more detail. And a lot of the things that you've already done, like creating your bylaws and your articles of incorporation to get state recognition, have set you up to file with the IRS. There are services that you can pay, like online, like Harbor Compliance and some other places, LegalZoom, etc., that can help you do this step. But people do it on their own all the time. It's just a matter of how comfortable you are, and if you'd rather pay somebody to make sure it gets done right. One reason to pay somebody or to get an additional person to help you with that would be that the normal process of filing and getting tax status recognition is 3 to 4 months. That process can be delayed and take even longer if there are mistakes or things that you forgot to include in the IRS process. So if you're in a hurry and you need to make sure you have tax status by a certain date, you maybe want to get some additional support through LegalZoom or some of these other for-profit providers that can help. So like I said, it's a 3 to 4 month process. One really important thing to do is once you've actually filed the paperwork with the IRS, you actually in good faith can take donations and people can deduct those donations from their taxes as long as you filed your paperwork. So if somebody makes a charitable donation to help you support the filing fees or something like that, after you've incorporated with the state, they actually can start deducting those from their taxes ahead of you officially getting that piece of paper. So again, much of this information is stuff that we use at the state level and stuff that we use to sort of get our organization off the ground. But you'll need to provide some information about compensation if you're paying board members at all. Again, that executive director / board chair role / founder role, if they're getting paid, you will have to disclose this here. This is, again, done to make sure that organizations are really serving a public benefits. There are some sketchy organizations where you see that the board of directors, and again, most boards of directors aren't compensated at all, are making really big salaries in nonprofits, and that's a red flag for a lot of donors, and it can also be a red flag for your tax status. So you want to make sure that you really think about how people are being paid and what they're getting paid. Most board members are volunteers and only receive reimbursement versus compensation. And especially in the startup phase when lots of people are not getting paid and you're just getting the organization off the ground, compensation is usually not the issue. The issue is making sure that you have enough people and enough volunteers to help support the organization. So one of the pieces that's really important in the filing, I'll come back to the question that was just posed, is the description of your activities. What are the activities you have done, you plan to do? Part of what the IRS is trying to do with that particular section is to make sure that your organization does serve a public purpose or a community-driven purpose, and that you're not just serving your members or a few individuals. And so what they're really asking you to do is demonstrate your organization serves a charitable purpose. So the main form for the IRS is what we call the Form 1023, application for exemption. So part of this is also driven by your finances as an organization. If you're getting most of your support from a foundation or just a few individuals or a corporation, you may actually have to go through a longer process to get your 501c3 status. And 501c3, again, is a particular type of nonprofit where people can make contributions that are tax deductible. There are other types of nonprofits that exist, like a 501c6, which exists to lobby and to do advocacy work. And so there are arts organizations that lobby and do advocacy work. But most of the time, most people want to start 501c3s, not 501c6s, which are more professional associations. So that public support test is that longer test where you're actually filing information about where you get support from. So that could be from user fees if you're starting, say, an arts collective and you're charging a user fee to come in and use the kiln or to use the studio space. That would be a demonstration of public support. If it's just one person writing a check and bankrolling the organization, that public support test will be harder to prove. So you really want to think about how do you broaden out the number of people supporting your organizations in order to get that 501c3 status. You could end up being classified as a public foundation versus a public charity, which again changes sort of your relationship with funders and with the community overall. The filing fee again is $850 for most nonprofits. It can be sort of one of the first big financial hurdles as an organization, because the filing fees for the state are between $50 and $250, depending on the size of your organization. Okay, so in the chat, somebody asked, is there a different process or a shorter process if you're a nonprofit in the past? The status has lapsed for several years. So you can apply for reinstatements. The best way to do that is actually to reach out to the IRS and ask about the process, because it usually matters how your status was revoked on how easy it is to get reinstated, both at the state level with the Secretary of State's office or at the federal level with the IRS. Okay. The other thing, and this was important, and this is kind of related to Lynette's question, is to really think about how you keep your IRS tax status. So once you've gotten your tax status with the IRS, it used to be if you were under $50,000 in revenue a year, you got your tax status, you went away, and you didn't really have to do anything else with the IRS for the rest of your life as a nonprofit until you got above that $50,000 threshold. Again, about 7 to 10 years ago, the IRS made a change to those regulations, because what was happening is they had all these nonprofits and they weren't even sure if they were still around anymore. They needed better information about these small organizations and what they were doing, and the benefit of those organizations to communities, since these organizations were not paying taxes. And so they instituted a different tiering system where all organizations have to file at least every 3 years a 990, a 990 EZ, or an Epost card. So if you're an organization who's under the $50,000 a year threshold, you file what's called an Epost card. And it is as simple as it sounds. It's literally like 6 lines you have to fill in. Anybody could do it. It's super easy. But you have to do it at least every 3 years. I recommend you just do it every year, and you just get in the habit of it, because 3 years goes by quickly and you don't want to be at risk of losing your tax status over 6 lines of the Epost card. As you grow as an organization, you'll usually move up into that 990 EZ category. Again, it's sort of like your personal taxes. The EZ form is relatively simple. It's only a couple pages. Once you get to the highest threshold, you're doing the regular 990. That's when you probably need an accountant. Even the 990 EZ, you might want some accounting or bookkeeping help with. Again, make sure to update your addresses and pay attention to notices from the IRS and the state governments, because again, sometimes laws change. We have a legislative session coming up. That charitable donation registration piece happened 5 or 6 years ago. A lot of organizations missed that, and then we're faced with fees and fines because they didn't register with the state. The other thing that lots of nonprofits do is they'll either get registered with the state or get registered with the IRS and not do both. Technically, under state and federal law, you need to be registered with both the IRS and the state of Nevada. If you're an organization who's actually registered with another state, you can actually fill out paperwork to do business in the state of Nevada. That's also on the Secretary of State's website. So if you're just expanding from California or Arizona, I don't have a list of recommended accountants for small nonprofits. Usually in most communities, if there's a nonprofit group that you're sort of connected with, or just ask around to other nonprofits and they'll tell you if they're using somebody. There are a couple here in Las Vegas that are kind of known for nonprofit work and tend to focus sort of their practice on nonprofits, because again, the accounting rules around nonprofits are a little bit different than they are for for-profits, and so they can be really difficult. So I'm going to actually end the slideshow here in a second. I was so worried about going over, I think I was fast instead. But that just means we have extra time for questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. If I can figure out how. Is it off now?
Not yet. Let's see.
Oh, there it is. Okay. I always lose that button. You can, I was telling Erica before we started today that I taught online, basically virtually and remotely for 2 years because of the pandemic. I've gotten a lot better, but I'm still not amazing at it.
When there's mess ups in person, we can fly right by, make a joke.
Yes, it's much more nerve-wracking when you're like, why won't the slide advance? And everybody's just
Absolutely.
staring at the slide. Yeah, in person, I just go, oh, I'll just do it on the whiteboard.
One of the questions we had in the chat was, can your registered agent address be residential?
You can't. There are also some, like if you don't want it to come to your personal address, a lot of organizations will, you can actually use a PO box. You just have to make sure you're checking that regularly.
And then about the process, if you were a nonprofit in the past and it lapsed for several years.
Yeah, like I said, I would reach out to the IRS and to the Secretary of State. I know that there's actually a form for the state of Nevada to get reinstated. And there's a fee associated with reinstatement, because again, a lot of especially smaller organizations that are kind of all volunteer led, that tends to happen. Whereas if the transition between new and old board members doesn't go well, somebody forgets to file the paperwork or forgets to tell somebody about the paperwork and it lapses, then you just have to get reinstated. Now, again, the IRS, you have to fail to file for at least 3 years. So you can go on the IRS website and look up if you have your tax ID number, that EIN number that I told you need to register for, you can actually go and look up and search for that. Are articles of incorporation public documents that we can research for examples? So I have actually included a couple examples that I pulled from state organizations in that handout. I also included a link to Candid, which is a nonprofit group that supports both donors and nonprofits, and they have a really great set of resources on bylaws. There's also a couple template things online, which Candid actually links to, where you can actually kind of fill in pieces and adapt, and it'll actually kind of output bylaws. What I would say though, if you do one of those things, make sure you really read it and make sure you're okay with all the auto text that gets generated. But it's a really great way to kind of start drafting them. And then I would say, then you really want to go through it line by line and make sure it works for you. If we're curious about an organization, where do we find their articles? So they may, in the state of Nevada, they don't file those with the state, so they're not legally required to post them. If you know somebody in the organization, maybe they would be willing to share them, especially if you're trying to get going. Now, if they're going to be a competitor of yours, they may not be willing to. But a lot of organizations do post them on their websites. The two I pulled for examples are posted online on their websites. Also, everybody's welcome to come off mute if that's allowed and ask questions verbally.
Yeah, I will make sure everyone comes off. So
if you had a nonprofit in another state, can you move to another state or need to close it and start? So if you have the IRS designation, you just need to incorporate in the state of Nevada, or and make sure you update your filing address with the IRS and update all of those pieces. So you can't actually, because the 501c3 status is a federal designation. And so you can actually just kind of move your corporate headquarters to Nevada. do you need to incorporate before applying for nonprofit status? I would say that, so I put this together and made it look like a super linear process, but for lots of organizations, it's not. Sometimes you have your board first, sometimes you have, sometimes you apply for the state and then it takes a while to get to the federal filing, et cetera. And so you do need to incorporate before you apply for nonprofit status. But you can do federal first or you can do state first. It really depends. I think it's easier to do the state level first because it's an easier process. But the law doesn't necessarily say you have to do in that order, if that makes sense. But I am also not an attorney. I'm a PhD. Do your board of directors need to be in the same state? No, they don't have to be. Can you explain the difference between a foundation and a public charity? So foundations, so all these are based on tax law. So these are really specific definitions. Foundations are organizations that are primarily created to support and fund public or charitable purposes in their communities, okay? And as such, they're required to disperse at least 10% of their assets every year. So that's one of the reasons you want to probably be a public charity versus a public foundation. Now, organizations sometimes, if they're a 501c3 and they've grown to a certain extent, sometimes they will actually create their own foundation to support their operations. So any of you who are in the state may have heard of Opportunity Village. Opportunity Village has an operating organization, which is a 501c3 public charity. They also have a foundation that they have separately incorporated for fundraising purposes that raises money primarily for Opportunity Village. So, okay. Did that explain that?
And if anyone wants to speak, you can raise your hand too. I'll let you on.
Okay. Y'all have me for at least, and I feel like I went way too fast because I was worried about running out of time. So I apologize. But in the replay, you can pause me and rewind me. Is there anything different about the process you explained for existing for-profit small business to start a nonprofit? No, so if it probably depends on whether you want to convert to a nonprofit or whether you want to have a nonprofit entity and a for-profit entity sort of operating side by side, which also does happen. So for example, MGM, one of the biggest employers in the state of Nevada, has a nonprofit foundation that they run, but they also still have their for-profit. So sometimes you spin off a nonprofit piece. You just want to make sure that's probably where you really do need an accountant to make sure that you have pretty bright lines between your for-profit operations and your nonprofit operations, because you don't want the money blurring back and forth between the two. How much money would you say it is to fully finish nonprofit status? So at the state level, like I said, it's around $50 to $250 plus maybe any local filing business licenses. I don't remember how much those are. I would guess they're probably around $100. So $350 plus $800. So it'd probably $1,500, $2,000. If you pay somebody to help you, you're probably adding another $1,500 to $2,000 through LegalZoom or one of those services. We're in the process of writing board descriptions. Do you know any templates or examples we could refer to? So job descriptions for board members. Again, I would look at that link in the handout from Candid. They actually have a ton of resources. The other place I would look, it's a really great place for resources for boards, it's called Board Source. It's a nonprofit that was created to support boards and board development. And they actually have a lot of free resources that you could look at as well. And they actually have some paid webinars and some other things as well, but they do have some things posted to their website. I spent almost more time on this lovely handout It's 5 pages, but it's also full of links. Because again, a lot of this stuff is really idiosyncratic to your organization. And so what I wanted to do is bring together resources that you can go back to and refer to, or places you could find things. And I wanted to kind of curate that for you guys, which means making sure that these are all really good sources and that they really were thoughtful and provided clear advice and clear content that you could use. So I didn't just throw together websites, I promise. These are things that if I were doing this, these are the places I would go. And I have been teaching at UNLV for 15 years, so I've done these a few times.
Thank you so much for taking that time.
But I think some of these resources can be a really good starting point. The IRS itself actually has some virtual courses you can take when you're getting ready to do your 1023 that I also included at the end of the handout as well. So they actually have resources on maintaining your tax exempt status, applying for 501c3 status. If you're hiring your first employee, they have employment issue. And I think what they did is they tried to create these to allow organizations to help themselves versus needing to make an appointment, talk to an IRS agent. Again, the IRS, people hate them, but they're really understaffed. And the nonprofit sector has grown exponentially without more agents being assigned to tax exempt entities. And so what they have, I think that to their credit, they've really tried to provide resources to help clarify some of these things, to really help organizations and agencies get through the process without a bunch of roadblocks or issues. So I need a drink. And yes, I will also provide the slides. I believe I also sent those to Erica already. And so those will also be available and you can actually see all my notes. I'm a little OCD and I almost type out my script. So you can actually probably even almost see a verbatim script of what I plan to talk about.
Yeah, as soon as this video is edited, we'll put all of these resources on our YouTube channel. And I'll make sure I put that in the chat.
Yeah. I guess I should have gone into more detail. Any more questions? I really just wanted to demystify this, but I also didn't want to spend time showing you paperwork because I feel like that is death by PowerPoint right there.
So
Yes, I have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
So my first question, if I want to organize something for the Afghani refugees, like a non-profit for them, yeah, how will it work? Is the same thing like any non-profits?
Yeah, so these steps are the same for arts organizations or other nonprofit startups. I gave some examples that were important for arts organizations since this is the Nevada Arts Council that's hosting. But the steps are really sort of generic for any nonprofit. Now, if you're doing this for Afghan refugees, but I'm assuming your operations are going to be in the United States?
Yes, correct.
Okay, because there's a whole separate process if you're wanting to do an international organization. So if you were going to deliver services back in Afghanistan, that would be a whole different thing. And we call those NGOs versus nonprofits. So. Okay.
So if it's international, it's different, you mean?
It is, yes.
So may I know what's the difference?
Well, so everything we talked about today is governed by US law. If you're incorporating or organizing in another country or planning to operate internationally, then you're also usually governed by the laws of the country that you're operating in and international law. And so it can get really complex. I have a friend who operates a nonprofit or an NGO in Somalia and does research in Somalia. And so she has gone through that process. And I was just like, I can connect you to the right person, but I am not that person. I study US-based nonprofits,
Mhm.
and so NGOs are a little bit different, obviously.
Okay, thank you.
Esmeralda High Desert Institute is a new upstart, and you've clarified a series of items for us. Great. I'm happy that hopefully, again, hopefully the resources that I included too will help clear up any of these any other little things. It was like I was starting from scratch. I hadn't thought about how to put this all together, because we do this usually over weeks in a graduate level course when we talk about starting an agency. And so I almost felt like I was writing a textbook chapter when I pulled together all these little pieces. And so I hope it was clear, because again, a lot of these things can be done in a different order. So again, sometimes you write your mission statement with your new board. Sometimes you do it ahead of the board so that you have sort of a pitch to new board members. So again, the checklist makes it seem like you have to do this before that. It's not necessarily the case too. So that's the other thing I want to emphasize. Any other questions? Erica, are you going to email out the handout?
Yes, and I will put it again in the chat,
Yes.
but I will also email to anyone who is registered about 10 minutes before.
Okay. Yeah, I think one of the nice things about the nonprofit area is that there are lots of resources out there. I think the hard part is coming through what the good resources are. And so again, that's what I tried to spend my time doing for you guys, is to really point you at things that I think if I were in your shoes, I'd really want access to.
All right. Is there any more questions?
Oh, well, there's, and at UNLV, we have two programs. We have a graduate program, and then through our continuing ed, we also have other courses that are available as well that are also very good, which isn't my program, but I've worked with them and I know that they do a nice job as well. And yes, I'll be on again in 2 weeks, and hopefully I'll have some more insights for you as we think about growing your nonprofits and making it bigger and better. So if you're a startup now and already have tax status, sort of where do we go from there, and how do we kind of transition into the next part? And even if you're still getting started, you're also again welcome to join us, because maybe you'll have some things to think about as you start up. I think starting up is the hardest part. And then after that, the next hardest part is hiring your first couple employees. And then maybe the loss of your founder. Those are the things, the big transitions I see organizations really struggle with. So
Thank you. Thank you so much. So in 2 weeks, we'll get back on at the same time for Going Beyond Great Programs, Building Organizational Capacity for the Long Haul. And this might be extremely helpful as a refresher too. Lynette, I see your hand raised. You can go ahead and unmute yourself if you want to talk. Hi.
Hi, how are you? I did ask another question in the chat.
oh, I'm sorry, I missed it.
That's all right. Thank you so much.
Is it if you cannot attend the session, will the session be available to review after the actual webinar?
Yes.
That's an Erica question.
Yes, as soon as we get some editing in, we'll have them up as soon as possible. We're gonna have everything up and going for this one by the 23rd, and we'll keep that rotating every 2 weeks. So everyone can watch it again before the next webinar.
Yes. And I believe they're up for almost a year after that.
July 2025.
Okay. Oh, over a year. But yeah, that way people can go back and revisit things. So maybe you're just getting started now and not quite ready. And in a couple months, you're like, oh, what was that thing about bylaws? Then you can go back or even share it with board members and share it with your stakeholders then too.
And Tony, you have your hand raised.
Hi, all. This is Tony Manfredi, Executive Director of the Arts Council. Just wanted to thank Jessica. I really appreciate the session today, and thank you all for attending. It's great to see such wonderful participation, and the content was fabulous. So looking forward to the next one.
Oh, thank you, Tony. And I'm just honored that we had so many people sign on and take an hour out of their day.
All right, and then as a last thing, before we go, I will email the link with the PDF, not a link to anyone who might be having struggles to download it. And I'll send that right now by the end of the day. So if you did not get to open it, you will, I promise.
Yes, and I'll also put my email in the chat. In case you have follow-up questions that you feel like weren't handled in the handout. I am in the first couple weeks of our spring semester, so be patient. I can't answer super detailed questions, but I can hopefully point you at some resources if I left something out.
All right, thank you so much, Jessica. I'm really looking forward to our next 2 sessions, and I hope to see you all there as well.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.